Phillip Blond, director at Res Publica, joins us now. David Owen from Jefferies still with us. Good morning, Philip. Nice to see you.
Good morning.
As we watch the story unfold here in Europe, how do we think about this politically? How do we start to maybe get a new narrative about European politics? Because things are changing quite fast.
Europe is under unprecedented security threat. It's threatened by revanchist Russia in the east, and now it's got an Islamic insurgency, the like of which it couldn't even dream of in the West. And if you look at some of the analysis, and I have, American intelligence puts the number of potential migrants coming across the Mediterranean at 45 million. And we also know that many of those will be driven by war. So you have a whole range of instability. What's now happening is the narrative of the EU as essentially an economic narrative is gradually being supplanted by the need for the EU to develop a security narrative. The trouble is most European armies are nowhere. The only two armies that have any ability to project power are the British and the French. The Poles are willing to fight, but they don't have the necessary deep infrastructure. So what we're going to see, in my view, is austerity trumped by a new security politics. But we haven't yet got the political will that will actually garner the West, the European West, to fight at the distance and on the ground.
How does the security story... Economically, we're going to see the narrative changing because we're going to move away from austerity. We're going to spend money on security. We're going to spend money on defence. We're going to see that from the UK today. But the security infrastructure is going to change. The Schengen Agreement is going to start to dissipate. We're already seeing evidence of that. Like, how quickly does that happen? Because that's going to be a major negative for the European story.
Well, here's the interesting thing. Why didn't France invoke Article 5 of NATO? Instead, Holland invoked a little-known Article 48 of the EU agreement, which called on all EU members to come together. I think, given America's pivot to the east and to its new Cold War with China, Europe is going to have to step into the breach and develop a common security policy that can operate at a distance and create what British Eurosceptics fear, this European army. Now, I suspect this will have to be led by an Anglo-British alliance, an Anglo-French alliance, because nobody else has the ability. It may well be that Holland is gradually building support to invoke Article 5, but it's not clear that that will happen. So what I think we will see is the beginnings of a narrative about actually the need to deploy European troops on the ground, because nobody thinks that we can defeat ISIS. Remember, Hollande has declared war. Others agree that this is now an existential threat to Europe. Are we going to see the narrative change so we can deploy European troops in theatre to essentially wipe Islamic State off the map? I think so, and I think that that's both needed and I think it will come, and that, I suspect, will be a pan-European project bolstered by the Americans, possibly at a distance, and that, I think, will be the new security theatre.
David, that's what that sounds incredibly expensive.
It does, and actually when you go back and you look through history about coming out of great recessions, the Great Depression of the 20s and early 30s, you had expansionary policies going into the Second World War, but also public works programs, and those tend to boost growth. So actually it may be helpful for eventually GDP, but obviously at the moment it's negative.
Economically, who's going to be on board with that? The Germans don't particularly want the ECB to do anymore. The Germans don't particularly want to be spending anywhere beyond their means. They have a balanced budget law in place. Like, how does this actually get funded?
Well, I mean, it's going to be at the national level. So, I mean, here in the UK, we know that there's going to be a slippage in the the budget figures. I mean, they were expecting there to be a budget surplus of 10 billion in 2019-2020. That will go by the by, and they'll probably push that into another year. And in France, obviously, they will step up and spend more. I mean, all these things will be happening. Germany is on the back foot, really. So I don't think they will be economically able to stop certain things happening.
Let's talk a little bit about Angela Merkel now, Philip. She's delivered an economic policy via a migration policy. The question is, does she have the economic policy right to be able to back the migration policy?
Well, here's the thing about Angela Merkel. You know, to Merkel has now become a verb in Germany, and that is essentially to sit out the political debate, see where the majority is, and then side with the majority. She did that, for example, over nuclear power. The trouble is, the security situation isn't something you can sit out and see where the majority are going. Germany has almost no military power or potency whatsoever. So actually she risks her 10-year legacy by actually looking outmoded by events. And actually the new security requirements are so extreme, they'll probably demand and require a different leader. And given that by most commentators she's made a strategic error that could actually prove fatal by essentially deciding for Europe, Germany decides for Europe, we'll take all the refugees. It's created a world where Europe can't control its borders, and we now know that inside those people who are running for their lives, remember, are also contained the people they're running from.
Philip thinks that Angela Merkel could actually be out of office as a result of that. He and David Owen from Jefferies are going to stay with us. Phillip Blond, director of Respublica, David Owen from Jefferies, is still very much with us. Philip, before the break, you were saying that you think she's in trouble. How quickly could that happen?
Well, it's the first crack in the facade. It's the first break.
Right.
But I think it's quite a fundamental break. If you actually look across Europe, politics have changed arguably in every single nation bar Germany. And the new politics are going to be essentially working class and protectionist stroke nationalist. And if you believe, as I was saying to David, if you believe the rise of the robot stuff, lots of middle class jobs are going to vanish, and those people will join the ranks of people who struggle. And actually, once that rises in Germany, what most people don't know is if you look at the very bottom decile and the medium decile,
spread's huge.
Germany has the highest rate of poverty, the highest rate of inequality in the whole of Europe between those two deciles. So I think there's a constituency that could oppose Merkel, and being wrong on migration is, I think, one of those existential questions that won't come back the other way. Because, as I said earlier, the waves of migration that are coming to Europe are potentially going to be 100 times greater than that currently being experienced. And the terror threat will only rise. And if you're out of step with the big changes, that's when you fail as a grand politician.
David, Merkel goes, let's postulate a theory. Merkel goes, what does that do to the European bond market? What does that do to the grounding that Germany provides economically at the core of Europe?
Well, I was going to say, actually, when she came in, she was, in a sense, very lucky. You know, sort of 10 years ago, Germany was on the mend, and we had a situation where, you know, all those reforms, labour market reforms, EU enlargement, all came through and benefited. In the last year or so, obviously, Germany's economic miracle has been tarnished by, obviously, the weakness we're seeing in a lot of their international markets, but also, you know, things like VW. So you know, things were sort of drifting off, and we can see other countries outperforming, like Italy. So Italy suddenly, you know, rises, and we have, you know, Italian GDP outperforming expectations. So I think, you know, Germany is losing its step in terms of being the, you know, sort of lead economic power.
But she has functioned at the core of Europe. She has kept the Eurozone together. She provided reasons for keeping Greece in. She provided the cash for keeping Greece in. Yeah, it was Hollande that ultimately probably brokered the deal, but nevertheless, you're in a situation where Angela Merkel and her determination to keep this on the rails. The project going. I mean, but things are, you know, as Philip's just been saying, things have moved on. And you can imagine the scenario where suddenly, you know, cracks appear and suddenly she's who acts as the core of Europe? Who acts as that lead? To quote the old quote, like, who do you call in Europe? Who's the person?
Well, here's the thing. You know, opinions divide on whether the Eurozone survives or not. But arguably, if Britain votes to stay in and the Eurozone fails, I would argue Britain becomes the de facto leader of Europe, and leadership is thrust upon it when it doesn't necessarily want it. And then we might potentially have a London-Paris axis that could actually govern Europe.
Wow. Okay.
Well, just think that through, because actually Britain has a huge amount of sympathy and friendships with the new accession countries that feel threatened by the Paris-Berlin axis. If Cameron and Osborne win the vote to stay in, everybody's got to think, well, what does this mean? An inner core for the Eurozone actually doesn't work.
Does that depend on Sarkozy being in office, do you think? Or?
I don't think, nobody really in France thinks Sarkozy's going to win it. This is if the money's on anyone, it's on Le Pen, and Le Pen, arguably, is the one who's going to be bolstered by these awful terror events. Now, the Front National is Eurosceptic. Front National is almost the old socialist model of a state that works for people, because that, as I said, is the new politics of Europe, the people who have been failed by globalization.
Guys, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Fascinating conversation. Phillip Blond from Respublica, David Owen joining us from Jefferies.